Welcome to the Defenders Conference 2019. We are obviously recording before a live audience here, and it is my distinct pleasure to have the scholars that have presented their views on gospel differences, and I will go from my right to left here. Rob Bowman, Bart Ehrman, Mike Licona, and Craig Keener, and they've all had the chance to lay out their case, and some issues have sort of come forward, and we see the differences. Some people might be wondering, hey, there might not be as many, or where exactly do they disagree? And especially for, I think Mike's was like, hey, where do I disagree with Craig? Well, I already know of a few places where they disagree, so I'm ahead of him on that one. But we'll certainly bring that out as we have our discussion today. Our panel discussion is geared towards really helping folks see these differences and to have these scholars put on their boxing gloves as they engage with one another and have some cross-examination going back and forth. Later on, we're going to have a special segment instead of rapid questions. We have some dry erase boards down here, which we're going to use to help folks see the differences between folks. But I wanted to first kick off with a question and engagement about the infancy narratives. This is something that was brought up many times, and there are different views on this. So if we could each go sort of in a line here and briefly, if we can, just a minute or two, talk about your view of the infancy narratives and whether that what we read about in Matthew or in Mark can be harmonized. If it can't be harmonized, do we still accept them somehow? Do we reject them? What's exactly, or maybe we don't know exactly what's going on there. If you could just describe your position, I think that would be helpful.
I think what we have in, is this working? Sorry. I think what we have in Matthew and Mark are perfectly reconcilable because Mark doesn't talk about it.
Did I say Mark? I meant Luke. Luke.
Sorry, cheap shot. I won't be back next year now. I take the position that the infancy narratives in Matthew and Luke are grounded, rooted in historical fact. I think that we're getting accounts of what occurred in the life of the Holy Family that go back to the principal sources of Joseph and Mary themselves. I explained this briefly, I think, in a little Q&A that we had after my opening session. I think that there are a number of rough areas where it's a little difficult to harmonize the accounts, and maybe one or two places at most, in my opinion, where a harmonization is at least problematic or difficult. But overall, I don't see any big contradictions among the between the two accounts that would impugn on the accuracy of the story overall, as we find it in both Gospels. So I'm comfortable in affirming them as historical accounts. I'm not bothered, of course, by the miracles that are recorded there, and I don't think the differences stand in the way of believing them. In fact, I think the obvious differences of having two completely different narratives and yet agreeing, as I mentioned, on some 18 points that are not, obviously dependent on one another, because I don't believe Matthew's copying from Luke or vice versa. That suggests that the story goes back behind or earlier than either Matthew or Luke, and therefore this is an early tradition or recollection, and I would argue that comes ultimately from Joseph and Mary themselves.
Yeah, right. So this one's louder than yours. Right, I have pretty much the opposite view. I agree that there are some things that are similar between Matthew and Luke's accounts, and you can indeed make a list. My view is that if you've got a friend who tells you 30 things, and 18 of them are right, and 12 are not, then the fact that they're right about 18 of them doesn't make that a reliable person. So if you've got two accounts that agree in 18 places, that statistic itself doesn't tell you very much if you don't know how many times they disagree. My view is that when you actually read them side by side, which is what I encourage you to do, just read one, then read the other. They are obviously very different from each other. Virtually everything all of Matthew's stories are different from Luke's stories. They tell different stories, and that's not a problem, of course, because they can tell different stories. The problem is they say some things that are directly at odds with one another. The genealogies cannot be reconciled. Matthew's genealogy is not Luke's genealogy. They both claim to be genealogies of Jesus, of Joseph, who's allegedly Jesus' father, supposedly Jesus' father, as Luke says. If Matthew is correct that the family fled to Egypt after the birth of Jesus, then Luke cannot be correct that they immediately went back to Nazareth. And so there are, and those are just two of the things. There's a whole range of things where there are internal contradictions between them and that contradict what we know about the facts of history, especially in Luke's account. There's nothing in the account that says anything about the sources of information. In other words, neither one says this is, Joseph's view or Mary's view. And the final thing to say is that these were both written 50, 55, something like that, years later by people who had inherited these stories, and the stories are at odds with each other at a number of really key points, and so I don't think that they are historically reliable.
So when it comes to the genealogy, from my understanding, a lot of genealogies, they don't have to list every single person in that line. And it seems obvious that Matthew omits a number of names, even Luke does, that are in the genealogies that we find in the Old Testament. So whoever chose whichever generation to record, they may be doing that for a particular reason. I don't know. In terms of how Matthew and Luke differ, Matthew has 42 generations. And when you read through these a few times, you start to notice that he likes the number 14. And it's 3 times that he gives the number 14. And in verse 17, he sums it up and he says, so we've got 14 generations between, was it Abraham and David, 14 between David and the deportation of Babylon, and 14 between the deportation and Jesus. So something about that number 14 seems to be special to Matthew. He wants to put it in these 3 sets of 14. And then you notice that in the 3rd set, he uses the name Jeconiah again, which was number 14. In his 2nd set, he's reusing it in the 3rd. He's kind of cheating there. So, and he does this to get that 3rd set of 14. So you ask, well, what's so special about 14? And a number of scholars have said that Matthew is using a rhetorical device here called gematria, in which numerical values are assigned to letters. So if you look at the word Dawid, it's based on 3 letters, a D and a V and a D. And the D is like the 4th letter in the Hebrew alphabet, so you've got 4. And then the V is number 6, and so you got 4, 6, 4, 14. And so they suggest that with gematria, Matthew has artistically put together his genealogy in order to highlight what he's communicating, that Jesus is the son of David, the Messiah. And if that's the case, then we want to recognize Matthew's artistry in this and not take it so much that it has to match up with generation to generation against Luke in that sense. So that's for the genealogy. And then when you come to the actual differences between after Jesus is born, yeah, it seems to me that there are some differences that are very difficult to reconcile. The primary one for me would be one that Bart mentioned earlier, and that is in Matthew, when they're in Bethlehem, Joseph is warned by an angel to get out of there because Herod's going to seek the child's life, and they go to Egypt, and they're there, for some time. Whereas in Luke, it's 41 days for the days of purification to happen after the birth. And then they go on the 41st day, they're there in the temple in Jerusalem, which is not far from Bethlehem, but they're there in the Jerusalem temple getting Jesus dedicated. And then after that, he goes to Nazareth. So the chronology between the two is very difficult to reconcile. What's going on? I don't know. I really don't know.
Thanks. I should have taken notes so I won't forget things. But in any case, I do agree with Bart that they've inherited these traditions, and I do agree. Well, actually, I think it's probably more than 50 years. I think this is a long time before, so this is not. It wouldn't be the same way I would deal with some of the events where the disciples were there and could have retold the story and so on. At the same time, well, and I know Bart and I wouldn't agree on the we narratives being actually from an eyewitness, but in any case, I think the eyewitness who traveled with Paul to Judea had plenty of time there he met James in Acts 21. He would have had time to learn some of the stories. But I don't think that either Matthew or Luke knew the other one's stories. I think if they had known the other one, if Luke had known Matthew's account, he would have probably taken that into account and said, okay, well, of course with Matthew, it's the children from 2 years old and under. So this is a few years after it could be a couple years after Jesus' birth. They're in Bethlehem for quite some time. I think Luke would have probably taken that into account. But it's like what you have in Acts 9:23, after many days, whereas you read Paul's letters, or you read Galatians, and you see, it was after many, many, many days. It was up to 3 years, or at least a year and a half, that Paul spent in Nabatee in Arabia before going to Jerusalem. So Luke has his way of condensing the material, and that fits some of what Mike has talked about in terms of condensing things. But I think if Luke had known Matthew's story, he probably would have said, okay, well, maybe this is true, and he would have built in for that, but he doesn't.
Hey, could I throw in just one quick afterthought? Bart just said a few moments ago he remembers an event from 44 years ago. What's the big deal about 50 years? Which may be too long.
It turns out that I'm wrong about that. My memory's wrong. So the fact that somebody can tell you stories, that a 90-year-old person can tell you stories of things happened in the 17th century, it doesn't mean those stories are right. It just means they have stories. And so my remembrance of what I did in 1976 might be wrong. I'll tell one of the I want to say something about genealogy, but one of the problems is that New Testament scholars who talk about memory generally base what they say about memory and oral tradition and eyewitnesses and how well we remember and what context we remember. They almost always say these things based on what they've heard other biblical scholars say. I spent 2 years of my life, about 5 years ago, I spent 2 years of my life not reading anything about the New Testament or about early Christianity or about religion. I spent 2 years reading studies about memory. And I can tell you that most New Testament scholars who talk about memory do not know what they're talking about. I haven't read Craig. I haven't read your book. I was just looking at it. So I read especially studies of psychology. Studies, legal texts about eyewitnesses. I read social studies about social memory. I did nothing for 2 years. And then I wrote a book about it, which I probably should have put memory in the title because people don't. The book is called Jesus Before the Gospels, where I explain what we really do know about memory and about oral tradition. And it is not what you hear all the time. So it's worth, anyway, so can I just say something else real quick? I just want to point out the three of us are actually agreeing that these accounts are not historically reliable.
Well, it depends on how you define historically reliable.
Well, if you read Luke's account, you're saying that if he had read Matthew, he would have said it differently. That's admitting that Luke is not telling you the way it happened. And so we're agreeing with that, and we're agreeing that there are reasons for that. One author might condense things. One author might have an artistic reason for doing things. So there are absolutely reasons. But if your question is, are they then historically reliable? No, they're not.
I think that's a really
Depends on the
wooden way
definition.
of looking at reliability.
If you say that the genealogy of Matthew and Luke, every name is different between David and Joseph. So they're not just leaving out a couple. They are actually giving completely. So you cannot say that genealogy, that Joseph, this was Joseph's father, then grandfather, and great-grandfather, all the way back to David. You can't say that's accurate if Luke's is different for whatever reason Matthew changed it or Luke changed it.
So if, let's say Matthew is doing his genealogy for artistic purposes, and his objective is not to do
Yes.
precise historical recounting,
Yes.
I would say just like with the Psalms then, I wouldn't say the Psalms are historically unreliable. I might not say they're reliable historically, but I wouldn't say they're unreliable. Could we say the same thing about the genealogy of Matthew?
You could say, yes, you could say it's an artistic thing and it's not to be taken as history. Just like the Psalms are not to be taken as history. But it's very different to say that when the psalmist says, the psalmist says something about how he has sinned and he wants God to forgive him. You could say, that's not a historical claim. But if you say Joseph's father was Jacob, that's a historical claim.
Does it say his father was
Yes.
Jacob?
Yes.
Okay. It does actually say father rather than saying so-and-so begat. It says it's his father.
Well, even
I'm sorry. If somebody
father-
begot you, that's your father. If a male begot you, that's what the word father means.
but father can also mean grandfather. I mean, if son of David,
Yeah, but it
can
can't
mean
be. But it
descendant
can't be.
of David.
The reason it can't be that it's not that he's saying that Jacob is his great grandfathers and that he's left out two generations, because every name is different. And so, like, if you had a bunch of the names that were similar and some were different, you can say, well, they left out a generation here. It is not like that. Every name is different. It's a different genealogy, and so they both
Do you mind
can't
if
be right.
I jump in here? Once you have one name different for whatever reason, you could have a long string of names behind both genealogies, and they could both be right, because everybody has multiple ancestors through various lines, and the lines increase every generation.
These are
you go back.
patrilinear, though. It's not like that. This is his father was this. That
that's-
person's father was that. That person's. So it's not like saying, you've got two grandfathers.
You only have to have one that is a father by virtue of something other than procreation to throw the whole assumption off kilter. And there are many ways in ancient world as well as in the modern world where somebody can be regarded as someone's father even though he didn't physically beget him.
All right, so if you all aren't going to want to do this, but if you actually want to read a study of this that talks about and explains why that doesn't work, read Raymond Brown's Birth of the Messiah. He goes through these explanations and he shows, so just write it down if you're really into this. The Birth of the Messiah, Raymond Brown was a brilliant scholar. He is absolutely a Christian, and he just points out that this kind of explanation cannot work, and he shows why, especially levirate marriages and all the various explanations. They just don't work.
I have read Raymond Brown. I'm not sure that I agree with him that it can't work, but just another comment on Matthew's adaptation. These are minor adaptations, so they wouldn't really make the case, but just you tempted me, and so I have to go there. But then I want to come back to memory. And that is, in Matthew, our translations, they kind of fudge things. They want to clear up what they think are typos, so that Ehrman, that wicked king in the genealogy, it really doesn't say Ehrman in Matthew. It says Amos, who was a prophet. And Asa, there's a letter added in Greek. It becomes Asaph. So he weaves the Psalms and the prophets into the background of the genealogy in a it's a small midrashic change, just adding a letter or changing a letter. But in any case, it's orthographic. But regarding memory, I read, of course, I read your book, and I read Daniel Schachter and a number of the sources that you cited, Barry Schwartz, and so on. But I actually think that while they do point out the errors of memory, both social memory in the case of Barry Schwartz, psychological memory in the case of Daniel Schachter, there's both those sources and a lot of others also point out the continuance of memory and substantial continuance of memory. So, yeah, people make mistakes, but I think there's actually a lot more that can be argued for.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and I think, of course, we remember things correctly. So I'm not saying we never, of course, most of the things we remember are correct. So how do you know if two sources are correctly remembering? Well, you compare them to each other and you see if they're consistent. If they are inconsistent, then somebody's not remembering correctly, or they're both not remembering correctly.
All right, we should get to some of the questions from our live audience here. But like I said, I hope you brought your sunglasses. We've seen some great engagement here between the different views. And so we've had some great questions come in. This question comes from 4523. If we can only judge Gospels as ancient, or rather by ancient biographical standards, and those standards are so low in regards to historical reliability, have we lowered the idea of reliability too low? So maybe Mike and Craig, you could take that first.
I don't know if I'd consider them low. I'd consider them maybe closer to ordinary human discourse, which, I think sometimes we're holding them to standards that we wouldn't hold one another to in ordinary conversation.
Or contemporary biography, maybe even.
Well, contemporary academic biography, you have to document everything and so on. Contemporary popular biography, I think you've got a lot of conflation and things like that can go on.
And maybe a parallel could be like translations, English translations. So take the New American Standard Bible and the English Standard Version. They're more like, what do you call them, functional equivalent or literal translations. And then take the Message, okay, which is a paraphrase. Should you judge the accuracy of a paraphrase according to the rules of a literal translation? That seems to me to be ill-conceived to do that. So you would do the paraphrase according to, is it retaining the gist? Is it retaining the meaning of what's going on? But if you're judging it by literal standards, that's the wrong approach.
I'm completely agreeing with both of these guys are saying, but I'm not sure that you all are understanding the significance of it. Because if you say that you're judging them by ancient standards, suppose you say that, okay, instead of saying we're going to judge the Gospel of John according to the standard of somebody who writes a biography of George Washington, you can't do that because these are ancient biographies. They don't do it that way. I completely agree with that. So if you apply that and say, okay, we're going to see how they stack up against, say, Arrian's biography of Alexander the Great. Okay, or if you say we're going to do it by basis of Plutarch's biography of X. I mean, just pick. Yes, that is exactly right. That's what you need to do. And scholars of Alexander the Great and scholars of Plutarch agree these are not historically accurate by our standards.
False.
And so, what really?
Do you want to get John Ramsey in on this?
Yeah. Christopher Pelling, leading Plutarch scholar in the world. He
All right,
wouldn't say it's unreliable, but he'd say it's true enough. That's the term he uses.
So
true enough.
does he think that Plutarch's life of Romulus is historically accurate?
No. And he says that very clearly in his Life of Thesis,
Exactly.
chapter 1. But that's because it's happening so far back, 800, 1,000 years before, where he says it's the land of poets and fabulists, and so he's going to reconstruct these to give them a semblance of history. However, when he comes to things like the life of Cicero, Caesar, Pompey, Cato, Eutychianus, then he says, yep, that's history there.
The other problem, of course, is that Plutarch was in the upper 0.001% of intellectuals in his world. Mark was not.
That seems to me to be a little bit elitist of a perspective.
No, it is elite. These people were elitist. Plutarch was a complete elitist.
Oh, he was.
Yeah.
But you've got so many cases of oral memory on a popular level where people can remember.
Okay, let's talk about oral memory then.
Yeah.
Right. There have been numerous studies of oral memory that have been done, and none of them by modern anthropologists indicate that oral memory is accurate the way you're describing it.
By verbatim standards. But in terms of substance, actually many
Not
of them
always.
do argue that.
No, not always. Even if you take your example of, even if you take your Ken Bailey example, I mean, he is just flat out wrong about so many things, and it's been proven that he was wrong. It has nothing to do whether he lived there for 18 years or not.
Whedon's critique that supposedly proved that, I've actually taken Whedon's critique to task on some points, but
Well, no, there are things to take task on, but his basic point, I mean,
but there's some things he gets wrong.
there are
Yes,
data that are just flat out wrong.
there's some things he gets wrong
Within a lifetime. So the
his
idea that like
overall
within 50 years we have a
substance is
good
pretty
oral
accurate.
memory. No, I'm sorry. You know, it doesn't take long for somebody to get information wrong about someone that passes along in oral tradition. All of us have had stories told about us. There are people, our friends have written things about me in books that are just wrong.
Yeah.
And it's not like 50 years later. He could have called me and I would have told him it's wrong.
Yeah. But we also have with oral tradition, often you have the basic substance of the events that are condensed and passed on accurately. And this is Walter Ong. This is major authors, major scholars in the field of oral tradition, which I go through and document in my book.
Okay, so anthropologists have studied, for example, speeches that are given. So you mentioned these people who memorize long lists of things.
Not verbatim.
No, not verbatim. And they'll say it's the same thing. So we've had anthropologists who go in the field in, say, in Yugoslavia, where people can memorize things as long as the Iliad and the Odyssey. Turns out they don't actually memorize these things.
Right.
Point one. They do not memorize
Not
these
verbatim.
things. No, they don't memorize them.
But
They're
basic
composing them.
substance of it, they do get right each time they change it.
No, they do it right means what? The anthropologist will
Substance,
record
not the verbatim.
that one person will sing a poem, and then 5 years later, go back, the guy will sing the same poem, and he'll say, it is the same. And one of the versions will be 1,000 lines long, and the other will be 3,000 lines long.
Yeah.
Does that sound like the same?
But the substance of the story stays the same. The same anthropologists say the substance.
It's a story about a
and the
guy whose daughter got
Same.
married, and she got happily married, and then her husband died. Yes,
So maybe
that's all
we
the same.
maybe we actually agree on the gist.
Depends what you call gist.
Yeah.
There was a Jesus.
Oh.
He was a Jewish teacher. He did come from Galilee. He did get crucified.
yeah.
Yes, the gist is right.
Yeah.
But what counts as the gist? Is walking on water part of the gist?
Well, it's certainly the gist of that particular episode.
There are all sorts of episodes that Christians made up about Jesus.
I'm not sure we
Really?
agree on that.
Do you think when Jesus was a 12-year-old, he really zapped his teacher?
Now, we're talking about, that's something that's beyond living memory. I'm talking about things that were within the case of living memory. I'm talking about the first century Gospels.
Okay, so you think every story in the Gospels actually happened?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't. But oral memory is not going to help you on that.
I'd like
because,
to-
Yeah, okay.
I'd like to get Rob in on this. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
I'm just surviving over here. I'm fine.
I feel like I need to have 20 years of education, just to keep up with these guys.
Oh, by the way, though, the question that was initially, can I just say one more thing about that, and then we'll come back to no, just like, for example, when in Acts chapter 2, you have Peter quoting from Joel, in the last days, says God, I'll pour out my spirit on all flesh. Joel doesn't say in the last days, he says afterwards. But, taken from the context, you can say, okay, in the last days. And Peter adds in a line, and they shall prophesy. That's not there in Joel. Is that a mistake, or is that the kind of license that they were allowed to take, and that it was assumed that they were allowed to take? Or when Luke retells the same story in different places and tells it in different wording, I mean, is he stupid, or does he assume that his audience is going to assume that he has those liberties? I think we can see from the text itself.
I agree. They have liberties. They have lots of liberties.
So Rob, so your thoughts here on this, perhaps a low concept of reliability. Does that not jive with your take on how trustworthy the Gospels are?
Well, as I mentioned are you hearing me okay? Okay, because I can barely hear myself. I'm okay. So, as I said in my breakout yesterday, it's, I think, hazardous to draw broad generalizations about all ancient Greco-Roman biographies and then impose these generalizations on the Gospels, either in order to uphold their historical accuracy or in order to impugn it, because ancient biographies differed in quality among themselves, one from another, and we're talking about a wide array of texts that simply have enough family resemblances that scholars like to kind of classify them together and call them Greco-Roman biographies, but that doesn't mean that you can take a generalization about the family and apply it to a specific individual text, just like you can't take the average height of people in a room and say, therefore, Kurt Jaros is, 6'2".
I wish.
Or Rob Bowman. You can't reason that way. So, and I would say the same thing, and I'm going to say this in terms of this particular field of research, as an amateur. So I'm just going to acknowledge that right up front. In terms of oral studies, oral memory, and the study of oral memories, you can't generalize from a lot of different studies about how oral memory generally works, or what the averages are, or what we often find, and in many cases they don't remember things the same way, or they tell it differently, or they tell it amazingly the same. You can't take any of that kind of stuff and then say, therefore the Gospels did it this way, therefore they did remember it accurately, or they didn't, because the Gospels are their own thing. We have to look at what the circumstances were that led to the writing of the Gospels. If you believe, as I do, that they are at least based on eyewitness testimony from people who were still alive when the writers at least started work on their books. And in the case of a couple of them, I think they were largely written by eyewitnesses. You don't have to worry about this oral memory tradition thing for 50 years, being passed down to several different generations of rhetoricians or storytellers. It's coming. There's a very short gap to get from the eyewitness to the text. If you don't accept that, if you think there was a period of a half a century of people playing telephone or something, then you're going to have a very different view of how reliable the memory is. So I just think we should be careful about generalizing from a mass of studies in a particular field like this, whether it's biographies, whether it's oral memory and so forth, tradition, to what is specifically going on in the Gospels.
Can I just say I completely agree with that, and I think that that's right. And the only reason I deal with oral tradition is because the traditional line is that oral tradition was reliable back then, and my view is that we don't know that. And in fact, we have reasons not to think that. If you do think they're written by eyewitnesses, though, then you need to look into how valid is eyewitness testimony. You can't just assume that if somebody's an eyewitness, they're going to be telling it the way it really happened. And there's massive documentation on that.
That's where multiple independent sources come in handy.
Right.
And look, you and I might disagree on how we're going to look at and define historically reliable. I understand that, and I think it's kind of the difference between the guy versus the girl version of the story. And this is something on which reasonable people can disagree. What I would say, though, is if we're going to say that the Gospels are not historically reliable, or they're historically unreliable because of these kind of differences, then of course we have to say that that's going to apply to all ancient literature, with the exception of perhaps Asconius, who my friend John Ramsey is researching right now. But if we say that all ancient, so you'd say all ancient literature is historically unreliable.
Well, no, I just mean you can't accept that it's reliable until you evaluate it. And you evaluate it by certain historical criteria that you use the same criteria for Plutarch that you use for John.
Right, but all of these guys take these kind of liberties that we're talking
That's
about.
right.
So if they're going to be historically unreliable, then you can have that definition. Again, reasonable people can disagree on this, but if we're going to apply that to all ancient literature, then I think that can give a false impression by saying it's all historically unreliable, because it gives the impression that we can know very little about the past, and of course that is a wrong impression.
Okay, but just a second. So you had a leap of logic there. First of all, I'm not saying it's all unreliable. I'm saying you judge each case individually. But suppose you could show that all ancient sources are unreliable. You can't say that's not true because then we wouldn't know about the past. Well, that would be the conclusion you draw. You can't know about but that is not why they have to be reliable. In other words, you can't say they have to be reliable, otherwise we wouldn't know.
Mike is saying, though, is that they all take these same kind of liberties.
I agree they all take the same. We are completely on the same page with that. And I'm saying that means that it doesn't make the Gospels reliable simply because they take the same liberties everybody else takes.
Right, I agree. So, but what I'm saying is, if we're going to say the Gospels are historically unreliable because Matthew says the centurion himself went to Jesus rather than the emissaries, and all the other ancient literatures are applying these same sort of compositional devices, therefore they would be unreliable,
Yes.
That gives the person who is not up on historical matters, which is most, that gives the false impression that we can know very little about the past. And I'm just saying, well, all I'm saying, Bart, is that, well, I'm just making that observation.
It is absolutely right.
Saying.
It's absolutely right.
Is there maybe a difference here between methodological approach? Should we approach the texts or ancient documents with a more skeptical eye to begin with, a neutral eye to begin with, or a positive, guilty, innocent until proven guilty approach?
No, historians always take a skeptical approach. That's what historians do. Theologians may not do it, but no, it is.
No, it isn't.
Mike, I'm sorry.
I think I found the difference.
I teach in a research university,
Yep.
which has a very large history department, and I can tell you the approach to history is to question your sources.
You can question them, but that doesn't mean you take a skeptical approach from the beginning to, well, okay, you don't assume that they're unreliable.
No, you do not assume they're unreliable.
All right, okay. As long as we come with an open approach and say, a neutral approach to say they may or may not be reliable, let's check them out, I'm with you.
Check them out.
Even if they use those methods that we talked about.
Yeah. No, you check them out. You use methods.
I'd like to suggest that there's a little bit of fuzziness in the discourse about reliability.
Right.
And the reason why I would say that is because reliability is not the same thing as accuracy. If I say that a particular passage is accurate, that's different from saying that the book in which it is found is reliable. Reliability means that you have reached the judgment that this particular text or source of information can be counted on to give you valid information, so that you're not having to verify, corroborate, or confirm every single detail in order to continue using the text as a source of helpful information. It might be more helpful or illuminating if we were to say, are the Gospels informative, historically informative? And avoid the term reliability altogether, because to say that they're historically informative simply means that we can go to them and find information about the past. To say that they're reliable and then turn that into a kind of a yes or no, black or white, switch on or switch off forces a kind of either or thinking on that whole question that I think is not helpful, because then we get polarized into our camps. I say it's historically reliable. Bart says it isn't. I think both of us agree that the Gospels are historically informative. We may disagree about how informative they are, but we both agree that there is information that can be learned from the Gospels about the historical Jesus.
I agree. Everybody, I think, here would agree with that. Everybody except for the mythicists would probably agree with that. And so when I say reliable, I don't mean a kind of a blanket statement. I really mean if the Gospel of Matthew says that Jesus gave this speech and this is what he said, is it true that he did it? And these are the words he said. That's what I mean by reliable. Did he really do that or not? And I think we have to evaluate it rather than simply assume that yes, he did. In fact, I think there are reasons for thinking he did not. So,
Gentlemen, at this time, I'd like you to ask that you turn off your microphones and place them down so that you can hold this dry erase board. 4 of them, 1 for each. Going to play a little trivia game, see how knowledgeable these guys are, after all. Okay, this is kind of like the dating game, yes. And well, let's start with not a trivia question. Let's get you used to writing on the board. Okay. So yes, there you go. And then the eraser is the cover. Yep. So you good. Okay. We've had some questions come in about the doctrine of inerrancy, and so this is a yes or no question. So I hope you can write out your answer. And I know there will be different definitions, so we'll go through and explain then. So if you could, for the audience, yes or no, do you hold to the doctrine of inerrancy? And okay, are we all okay, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Okay, so here Rob says yes. We have Bart says yes. No, sorry, I forgot no. Mike says yes, and Craig says Sulege. You say that I do. Okay, so now let's go and maybe have each of you describe what you mean, just briefly. So, Rob, you said yes.
Sorry. When I affirm that the Bible is inerrant, I'm saying that what the Bible teaches and affirms, what it intends to convey, is truth. And it can do that in a variety of genres, in a variety of ways, according to a variety of conventions. But when we determine what the text actually said, that the biblical writers produced, and we've understood it correctly, what it is presenting to us, what is it intending to convey to us, would be truth.
my view is that the word inerrant means having no errors. And so if the Bible has errors, it's not inerrant. And I differentiate between inerrancy and truthfulness. That something that we're not really asking, do you believe in the theological truths of the Bible? If the Bible says that Jesus walked on water, and he didn't really walk on water, it's trying to affirm that, and it's wrong. So it might contain a kind of religious truth or spiritual truth, but it's not inerrant. No, it could be wrong in all sorts of ways. I mean, it could be wrong, but I'm talking about history now, but we're just kind of scratching the surface. I mean, I'm just talking about history, but we could talk about philosophical truth, theological truth, religious truth, all sorts of truth. Yeah.
I would define inerrancy as saying the Bible is true, trustworthy, and without error in all that it teaches. I would also say that this applies not only to the autographs, but to our present Bible. I am not concerned on whether there are some errors in some peripheral, insignificant details. That doesn't bother me if there are. So I'm not saying that there are any, not saying that they're not. I'm saying I don't know. I don't really care. I'm just saying that the Bible is without error in all that it teaches. Autographs and present Bible.
Just concisely, I agree with Mike and with Rob.
Okay, now we've got. Oh yeah, and not Bart. Yeah. All right, some trivia questions now. Okay, here's the first trivia question. How did Judas Iscariot die? Take a moment. Tell me your answer. All right, take a moment. Bum 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 ba da 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 dum bum bum ba da dum bum 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 ba dum bum 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 bum. How'd I do? All right. Craig's finishing up here. The question is, how did Judas Iscariot die? You may get a chance to explain, Craig. You may get a chance. Yes. Oh man, the guy who wrote the commentary on Acts. Yeah. Okay, he's finishing up, and I hope he is because he's at the end of his board. Okay, turn the boards over in 3, 2, 1. Rob says slowly. Bart says depends which account you read. Mike says hanging, and that's his guess. Craig says possible harmonization. If it is harmonized, the rope broke or was cut after he died, and his guts splattered. Okay. Okay, well, first let me give a little context. So there are, it depends which account you read, yes. So there are two possible ways the scriptures seem to say that Judas died. One is that he hung himself on a tree, and then the other is that he threw himself down a hill. No. Fell down a hill. No. Okay, well, see, I'm not the New Testament scholar here. So we will let these gentlemen explain. Papias. Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to have to pass the microphone along again. Let's keep these answers brief. We'll start this end. Okay. Your answer for Judas Iscariot.
Oh, just which account you read, but I do think there is a way, if you harmonize them, there is a way that they can be harmonized. I mean, if they cut the rope, which would be the simplest way, and it's not. Papias says he was swollen, he couldn't get through a door, and he exploded.
You learn something new every day.
Well, the Papias account comes from someone of Laodicea, I think it was, but it's 4th century. And so I think it'd be fair to ask, did Papias really say that? Because that is a kind of a weird story. So I probably tend to think that Judas hanged himself, and Luke's account where it says that he fell headlong and his guts burst open. I looked up that term about falling headlong, and I found that when you look in the Septuagint, New Testament, elsewhere, it is kind of a figure of speech equivalent to what we might say today. His career took a dive when, and so that could have something like that. I'm not trying to do something really stretch and be. I'm open to a real contradiction here, but I do think that it's possible. I'm seriously possible that Luke is using some sort of a figure of speech there, and that there isn't actually a contradiction.
On Papias, the thing about Papias is that people like to quote him when it supports views that they like, such as that Peter, that Mark was Peter's secretary and wrote down what Peter told him, and that, so you get, and Matthew wrote down the gospel in Hebrew. They like these passages because it confirms their views, but then the passages that don't confirm their views, they say, they don't trust Papias. But the Papias quotations all come to us from later sources. They don't, some of them, they all come from later sources. So, Matthew says he hanged himself. The book of Acts says that he fell headlong and he burst his guts over the field. And it's not, the contradiction is not just that, it's also who bought the field and what happened to the money. So there are a number of contradictions in these accounts. I don't think it works to say that it could be reconciled by saying that somebody cut the rope or that the rope broke, because he fell headlong. If somebody's hanging by the neck and the rope's cut, they fall feet first. And I don't think it works. It's an interesting idea, Mike, you've got, that it's a symbolic statement. And the word can be used metaphorically, but usually it's not used metaphorically when it's giving a kind of a physical description of something that happened. You see what I mean? And this is a physical description of something that happened. So I think it means that he fell headlong.
My facetious response that he died slowly was meant as a tongue-in-cheek way of saying that I think this may be one of those places where we simply don't have enough information to give a confident answer as to how we should correlate these two passages. The traditional, or at least very common, harmonization that Craig mentioned, I think is possible, but I don't think we can argue strongly for it. I think it's just a possible explanation. I think Craig was going to comment that if he had to choose, he might think that Matthew was being a little bit more artistic in his description than Luke. I can't see any reason why Luke would make up these details for some kind of theological purpose. Maybe Matthew might have, but in any case, I think that we're going to run into this in some places in the New Testament where we have accounts that we just don't have enough information to be sure or to be confident in a particular resolution.
Quickly.
So in terms of response to your statement about, we're being selected in what we trust Papias for, the guy who quotes Papias on that Judas thing, we don't know much about him, and so it's hard to say whether he's reliable. But Eusebius is quoting him on the other stuff in terms of Matthew and Mark, where Mark's getting his actual text. Quoting the actual text there. And it's not just that testimony, it's the testimony from others, and there's other reasons to think that Mark is getting his source, let's say, from Peter. The evidence we have for the authorship of Mark is superior to what we have for Plutarch's Lives, and yet no one questions whether Plutarch wrote the Lives. They question some of the Moralia, but none of the Lives. And yet our best source for the Lives is the Lamprias catalog, which is a minimum of 100 years after Plutarch's death, and maybe be more than 200 years, and it's falsely attributed to his son. But nobody questions whether Plutarch wrote the Lives. And I'd say despite the problem with this one source in the 3rd or 4th century reporting this weird story about the death of Judas, I don't see really much problem with what Papias is saying.
How about the other sayings of Papias?
Which ones?
Any of them. About the glories of the kingdom. Jesus allegedly said that in the kingdom of God, every vine will have every vine will have 1,000 boughs, and every bough will have 1,000 branches, and every branch will have 1,000 twigs, and every twig will have 1,000 sprigs, and every sprig will have 1,000 clusters, and every cluster will have 1,000 grapes, and each grape will yield 25 to 30 gallons of wine. So, really? The comments people want to trust on Papias are the ones that they agree with. The ones they don't agree with, they say, well, you can't really trust those.
That one sounds to me, though, actually later church fathers thought he was, something was wrong with his brain. But and part of it was the different millennial views too. But having said that, it looks to me like the example that you gave sounds to me like fairly good apocalyptic kind of language like you might have from a Palestinian Jewish sage.
You think Jesus said that?
All right, we're running low on time. Last trivia question here. This stems from, good save by me. Okay, we have two seemingly conflicting passages. Mark 6:8 says, "These were his instructions. Take nothing for the journey except a staff. No bread, no bag, no money in your belts." Luke 9:3, as it reloads, says to take nothing, not even a staff. Okay, it's the equivalent parallel account, reading horizontally. So the trivia question is this: Did the disciples take a staff? Like Mr. Bean, you know? 3, 2, 1, and turn. A question mark. Half of them did. Yes, probably yes. Okay, let's go through quick explanations, under 60 seconds.
I really don't know, but I would lean towards saying yes, they took a staff.
Told them not to, so they probably didn't.
Matthew and Luke say not to take one. Mark says to take one. I think if we'd been there, Jesus said take one, but either Matthew, Luke, or the source from which they drew changed it in order to make the point more clearly that they were to rely on God for everything. The point, I think, is there with Mark, but Matthew, Luke, or their source want to make it all the more clearer, so they simplify.
You think they're reliable when they changed it?
Yeah. Because
So
they're
he said-
communicating the gist accurately.
So he said take it,
Yep,
and
that's correct.
they're accurate in the
Yes,
report.
in the gist of what they're reporting. Absolutely.
Okay.
I think probably I would agree with Mike on that. In terms of the main point there, I do want to qualify something from earlier, where Bart asked me if I believe, the events in the Gospels. That I'm not saying that my historical methodology takes me that far, and like Rob was saying, Gospels are different, oral tradition's different. It doesn't guarantee those things. So I go beyond the evidence that I have on faith, but, the evidence I have, I think, points towards reliability, but he asked me what I believed, and so I said what I believe is personally. Yeah.
Gentlemen, same time next week. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for participating in the panel discussion. Well, this has been a lot of fun. What a way to close out the conference. I want to thank you all for coming. That does it for the program today. I'm grateful for the continued support of our patrons. Those are folks that just chip in a few bucks each month. And the partnerships that we have with our sponsors. They are Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, and Fox Restoration. I want to thank our technical producer, Chris, for all the fine work that he does live streaming. Great job, Chris. And to our guests today, Craig Keener, Mike Licona, Bart Ehrman, and Rob Bowman. Give them one more round of applause. And last but certainly not least, I want to thank you, the listener and viewer, for joining us here for another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. We'll see you next week.